So you have your exams. There will be a curve in the class. I don't know how big that is. Roughly based on the side on this exam, I would say that probably the curve will be roughly about 10 points, maybe a little bit more towards the bottom of the distribution. So, to give you a rough idea, and of course there's no promises about this, but to give you a rough idea, if you added roughly about 10 points to your score and put it on a regular 90, 80, 70, 60 scale, that should give you a general idea about how well you did on the exam, right? And as I said, probably at the bottom of the distribution, there'll probably be more curving than up at the top. But that's, just gives you a rough idea. So what I would like you to do is over lunch, take a look at your exam, okay? See what you did well on, see what you struggled with, come up with a list of individual questions. And then when we meet this afternoon, I will go over the exam in more detail. Okay, so I'm not going to do that here this morning, but this afternoon I will go over the exam in more detail. I'll also have a little bit of time after class this afternoon. If any of you want to talk with me, person to person on Zoom, I'm happy to talk with you individually. But we're going to save most of the discussion for the exam this afternoon. Like I said, I would prefer if you kind of look over given that probably most of you didn't have a lot of time to look over your exam before class this morning, I prefer for you to look over your exam, think about it a little bit, think about maybe ways that you prepared well for the exam, maybe think about things that you didn't do so well, either in terms of preparation or in terms of actually taking the exam itself. And then, we'll talk about it this afternoon. And one of the things I want to get from feedback from you this afternoon is just how the actual mechanics of taking the exam went, because I realize this is not a situation that we're used to taking exams on computers and sending files in and things like that. And so I also happy to spend a little bit of time this afternoon talking with you about what went well for the exam and what didn't. It seemed like most of you were able to kind of figure out ways to either, do write answers or do calculations on paper and take a picture, or some of you were able to kind of, put things together. It seemed like most of you were able to manage that pretty well, but I definitely want to get your feedback. So we'll save most of that discussion for this afternoon, if that's okay with you. All right, so any quick questions about any of that before we go on? So this afternoon, I will also be sending you, when I send you the agenda for tomorrow, I'll also be sending you homework number 3, okay? So we're right back at it, right? Homework number 3 is going to be on chapters 8, 9, and 11. So basically, homework number 3 is going to be on the material we covered on Tuesday and the material that we covered today, all right? So we should have covered all of them. Hopefully, if assuming we make as much progress as I hope we'll make, we will have covered all the material that should be on homework number 3. Homework number 3 is going to be due on Monday. Okay, so you're going to have the weekend to do it, but yeah, you should definitely get a head start on it tonight, because that way, if there's questions, you can ask me questions tomorrow in class. Okay, so that's just another heads up. So what are we doing today? Well, really, today is in many ways the beginning of the second half of this class, okay? And I don't mean that literally, because we are pretty close to the first halfway point of the class, but I also mean in terms of the material, in the sense that really up to this point in class, we've been talking about the long run, okay? We talked a little bit about macro data, and then we've talked about the long run. So we have talked about trend behavior in macroeconomics. And so today we're really switching gears, and most of the rest of the block, we're going to be talking about the short run, okay? We're going to be talking about short run macroeconomics and how we think about things like business cycles. We're going to talk more about monetary policy and fiscal policy and its impacts. We'll talk about debt crises, right? But we're going to talk more about the short run. Now, you might say, well, isn't the long run the most important right? Isn't the long run the most important? Why are we spending half the class talking about the short run when really the long run should be the most important? And to that, John Maynard Keynes always has had the best answer. When asked why does he spend so much time thinking about the short run, Keynes's response was, well, in the long run, we're all dead, right? Meaning, really, the long run is a nice theoretical construct, right? But what really happens is that we live life in the short run. We live life day to day. And so to understand how macroeconomics works day to day is a very important thing, right? Is a very important thing. So we've talked about this distinction between the long run and the short run. In fact, you had a question about this on your exam, right? About the difference between the long run and the short run. To this point, we have talked about long run models, meaning our focus has been on trend behavior. Or you could think about this as average behavior over long periods of time. Right? So the first question on your exam yesterday is, how do we distinguish between the long run and the short run in macroeconomic data? Well, macroeconomic data, the long run is trend behavior. It is essentially long run average behavior over longer periods of time. So for instance, we talked a lot about the natural rate of unemployment, right? Which is the long run rate of unemployment. Or we've talked about potential output, meaning trend output. What happens when the economy is at full employment? So another way of thinking about trend behavior is when the economy, when all of our resources are being fully utilized, we are at trend. We are at what we'll call potential output, right? Potential output or trend output. So that has been our focus in the models that we've talked about before, right? So when we talked about the long run model, I'm sorry, the simple model of production, when we talked about the Solow model, when we talked about the Romer model, these were all really long run models, right? Focusing on trend behavior and average behavior over time. Now, what we want to do here over the next big chunk of class, right, really over the next 10 days, is we want to talk about a short run model. What's the focus here going to be on? Not trend output, but current output, right? We want to try to understand current output, not just long-term behavior. So in other words, we want to think about why we have deviations from trend. What we're going to call short-run output. So how do we distinguish short-run data from long-run data? The short run is deviations from trend. It is the difference between current output and trend output. And so we want to begin to think about, well, where do these deviations come from? So instead of talking about, for instance, the natural rate of unemployment, we want to talk about cyclical unemployment. We want to talk about business cycles. Why is it that output goes up and output goes down? And of course, we want to talk about, stabilization policy, meaning are there ways that we can use government policy to try to stabilize these swings in output? So if you just, for instance, if you just think about what's going on today with COVID, right? We know that output has fallen fairly significantly. Today, output is below trend. We'll look at some estimates of this, but output's probably 3 to 4% below trend, right? There's very little in the Romer model or the Solow model or our simple model of production that helps us understand that, quite honestly, right? I mean, why output would go down by 5% is not really something that you can understand, or at least in this case, right? At least in what's happening to the U.S. over the last 9 months. The Solow model, Romer model don't really give us much insight into why, a pandemic would cause output to go down, right? So we really need to think about a different kind of model, right? A model that helps us think about deviations from trend and helps us think about business cycles. And so that's what we're going to try to develop. So in other words, to put this another way, we want to think about this, what we're going to call Y tilde, or short run output, right? What is short run output? Short run output is just the deviation from trend. Right, where YT here is current output and Y bar T is trend output. So this is really how we're going to think about output here in our short run model. We want to think about what determines short run output. And what determines short run output? It's things that cause us to deviate from trend. And here we're going to put it in a percent deviation, right? So Y tilde is actually going to be a percentage, kind of like inflation. So if inflation is 2% and short run output is 1%, what does that mean? That output is 1% above trend. If short run output is negative 2%, what does that mean? Output is 2% below trend. Okay? So we will be using this conception of short run output, right? So we're going to be using this notation Y tilde a lot. And once again, what is Y tilde? It's the percent deviation from trend. So to maybe help you think about this visually. Sorry, share is not working here. Here we go. Okay. So think about it this way. Here's a figure. I can't remember which figure this is from your book, but it's better for me to show you the figure than to try to draw this. If you look at the left-hand panel, panel A, here's just a very simple diagram of output where you see the dotted line is trend output. But notice that actual output, which is the blue line, is sometimes above trend and sometimes below trend. So what's true when we're above trend? Short run output is positive. Y tilde is greater than 0. And what happens when the blue line is below trend? Then short run output is negative. In other words, we are in a recession. So if you detrend the data, meaning subtract trend out, you can move to the right-hand side figure, which here on the vertical axis is just short run output. And notice that short run output is positive here in that first period, and then short run output becomes negative when actual output falls below trend. So that's how we're going to think about short run output, right? We're going to be thinking about short run output as deviations from trend. And the goal here is to help us think about business cycles, right? So before we jump into this, right? And basically, I've already kind of jumped into chapter 9. Chapter 9 is more of what I would call an introductory chapter, right? Or kind of introducing us to the short run model. before we kind of begin the building of our short run model, let's just take a minute here to talk about some of the facts about business cycles that we're going to try to explain with our models, all right? So what are some of the things that we know about business cycles, some of the things that we want to try to incorporate into our short run model? Well, the first thing to note about business cycles is that business cycles are not cycles, really. They're not cyclical. And what do I mean by that? Well, honestly, what I mean is, if you go back to this graph here above, this is not a realistic representation about what business cycles look like, right? They don't look like smooth curves. They don't look like cosine or sine curves, right? They don't look like that at all. They're actually fairly irregular in length. They're irregular in depth and timing, right? They're really kind of all over the place, right? There isn't any sort of regular pattern to them. You can maybe see this a little bit better if I show you this. Right? So here's just some more recent data. This is looking at unemployment, right? The blue line here is unemployment. And the gray periods that are shaded are periods of recession, right? Meaning periods of time when output is below trend. And notice that once again, you don't see any really great patterns here. Sometimes recessions are close together, such as you notice here, for instance, in the 1980s, we had a recession in 1980, we had a recession in 1981, and then we had a recession in 1982. And then sometimes they're far apart. We had a recession, there was actually a 10-year gap between the recession in 1991 and the recession in 2001, right? So they're irregularly spaced. Sometimes recessions last a long time, right? The recession of 2008 lasted about 16 months. And then sometimes recessions are very short. We've had recessions that have lasted only 6 months. And then one of the things that's interesting here is you can see what's happening today, how COVID has really kind of swamped the behavior of almost all other post-war recessions, right? That in many ways, what's happening here the last 6 to 9 months is a complete outlier. We've never seen unemployment spike so quickly as we saw in March and April of this year. Of course, the good news is you'll notice that unemployment has dramatically fallen again too. Not all the way down to where it was before, but it has dramatically fallen. So a lot of what's been going on here in the last couple of months is definitely outliers. But that's the point, right? That in many ways, business cycles don't have regular patterns. And that's a clue for us, because this tells us that we need to think about kind of the fact that each business cycle is unique and might have different causes, right? In our model, we have to make sure that we incorporate the fact that different business cycles can have different causes. So that's the first fact, right? The business cycles are not cycles. Second fact that we should be aware of here, and actually I forgot to show you this, but this is just kind of reproving the point. This is from your book, Short Run Output. And once again, notice here how our short run output is fairly unpredictable, right? It doesn't appear to be following a regular pattern, right? In terms of when recessions come, how deep a recession is, how long they last, right? Not a particularly regular pattern. However, we do see, and the second fact that I want to share with you is that most macro variables move together, right? Meaning almost everything in macro is pretty consistently pro-cyclical or pretty consistently counter-cyclical. And we've defined these concepts before in class, but I put them up here for you to recopy. Pro-cyclical means that the positive correlation and deviations from trend with X are positively correlated with short run output, right? So in other words, when short run output is positive, the variable also tends to be above its trend. Countercyclical means that when short run output is positive, the variable tends to be below its trend. In other words, there's a negative correlation between deviations in trend of the variable X and short run output. So for instance, look at inflation, right? Inflation, as you can tell from this, is fairly pro-cyclical, right? Not perfectly pro-cyclical, but fairly pro-cyclical. What tends to happen during those gray recession areas? Inflation tends to go down when output goes down. And then what happens when output goes up? Inflation tends to go up, right? Not perfectly, once again, not perfectly, but pretty strongly. And you can actually calculate the correlation here, and you'll find the correlation is pretty close to about 0.35, right? So not a super strong relationship, but definitely a pro-cyclical relationship. Fact number 3 about business cycles. Not all of the components of GDP move at the same magnitude. In other words, some components of GDP are very volatile, some are not so volatile. What tends to be very volatile? Investment. What tends to be the least volatile? Consumption. So here's just a little bit of data looking at the standard deviation of output, the standard deviation of consumption, and the standard deviation of investment. And notice that consumption is actually less volatile than investment. So consumption is relatively stable in an economy. Investment, on the other hand, is very volatile. Investment's about 3.5 times more volatile than output. So that's a clue for us, right? That's a clue, because the clue is that this suggests that investment is playing a big role in changes in output, right? Because when investment's that volatile, it's obviously driving a lot of the changes in output. And so we're going to have to understand investment if we're going to understand where business cycles come from, right? That's the clue. If we look at specific markets that are the most volatile, we tend to see that labor markets and financial markets respond the most to business cycles. And once again, this is a clue for us into where we need to pay particular attention if we're going to try to understand business cycles. If we're going to understand business cycles, we need to understand how labor markets operate. We need to understand how financial markets operate. And we will do that in our short run model, right? We will see that we spend a lot of time thinking about labor and financial markets, right? Because that in many ways is where the interesting stuff is happening, right? So just to get some idea of how volatile employment is, here's figure 9.4 from your book, which looks at the month-to-month changes in employment. And you can see that this is all over the place, right? And there are some big spikes. And this doesn't include 2020 data from COVID, right? So if we could look at 2020 data from COVID, we'd see massive spike in 2020, right? A massive negative change in employment. So employment is very volatile. That's a clue. Likewise, you all know this, stock prices are very volatile. And it's not just stocks, it's really all kinds of financial markets, bond markets, interest rates, just all kinds of assets, right? Many different sorts of assets tend to respond volatilely to changes in macroeconomic conditions. And so we need to try to understand why that is, right? We need to understand why that is and why it matters, right? Why financial markets matter to macroeconomic performance. And then finally, here's the last fact, is that while it may not seem like it, business cycles have become less frequent and smaller over time. In other words, business cycles have not been as bad over the last 50 years as they were for previous era in US history, right? So output fluctuations in the post-war era have been about 20% smaller. And recessions have definitely been less frequent. Why is this? Is it because of a change in the structure of the economy? Possibly, that's contributed. But I think the better, more persuasive argument is that we understand macroeconomic policy much better. So in other words, the reason why business cycles have been smaller is because of economics. That we have today better tools in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy in trying to respond to economic slowdowns when they occur. So, we will talk about that, right? Obviously, one of the things we want to talk about in our short run model that tries to explain business cycles is we need to talk about policy, right? We need to talk about monetary policy and fiscal policy and why it matters. Okay, so business cycles are costly, right? Just a couple of statistics. A 6% drop in GDP is about $3,200 a person, right? So, this is a significant reduction in people's standards of living. The typical business cycle is associated with a loss of between 1.5 and 3 million jobs. The US economy has lost about, at its peak, lost about 10 million jobs in 2020. That's 10 million people. That is a lot of lives. And one of the things that we tend to observe is that when people lose money, lose income, and when they lose jobs, we see increases in suicide rates, we see more divorce, we see more drug use, we see falling birth rates, life expectancy goes down, right? We've actually seen in the US, we've seen life expectancy fall for the first time among white males over the last 3 years. And in large part, this is not associated with COVID, it's associated with drug use and other social dysfunction. And oftentimes social dysfunction is directly related to economic dysfunction. And so, this stuff is important, right? It's easy to kind of say, well, if I understand the long run, don't I understand what matters? Well, not really, because we don't live in the long run, right? We live in the short run. And so we need to understand, why economies go up and down on a current basis, just as much as we need to understand why economies go up and down in the future, right? Or in the past. So we are going to develop a short run macro model, right? And that's really what we're going to be doing here for the next few days. In chapters 11, which is what we're going to talk about today, chapter 12, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, chapter 13, which we talk about on Monday, and then chapter 10, which we talk about on Tuesday. So we're actually going to do these chapters a little bit out of order. And so this short run macro model that we develop is really based on Keynesian economics, right? So this is not what we're going to develop in this class is not the Keynesian model, right? It doesn't look anything like the Keynesian model that Keynes himself actually developed. But we're going to call it a Keynesian model because it has many of the insights that Keynes brought to how macroeconomics works in the short run. You probably, in other classes, if you've had me, you've heard me talk about Keynes. Keynes was undoubtedly one of the most unique individuals of the 20th century. I have written down here, he was a statistician, a speculator, a treasury secretary, a pianist. He married a famous ballerina. He was a member of the Bloomsbury Group for Virginia Woolf. He was the founder of the Bretton Woods post-war monetary agreement that we'll talk about. He fundamentally changed the way that economists think about macroeconomics. And in part because Keynes basically lived through World War I, right, in which he essentially served as British Treasury Secretary, World War II, where he essentially played that same job, and the Great Depression, right? He served through massive times of economic upheaval, right? And it really caused him to rethink just how much long-run macroeconomics can tell us about how things really work in the real world, right? And the real world is now, the short run. So Keynes really thought that classical economics, right, long-run economics really had no answers to many of the pressing day-to-day questions for policymakers, right? Like, you know, what answer does the Solow model give us as to what monetary policy should be doing with interest rates? It gives us nothing, right? Just as it gives us very little insight into how we should respond to a pandemic or how we should respond to a financial crisis, right? Because that's not really the question that classical economics, right? And by classical, I mean economics kind of focused on the long run. They really had no interest in these questions, right? Nothing to add to that. And so what we're going to see is that Keynes's key insights, and this is really what we're going to focus on in this short run macro model, is that we have to move away from perfect competition and perfect information. That's how you begin to understand the short run. The short run means imperfect. In the short run, we don't have perfectly competitive markets. We have market failure. Markets don't always work. Markets don't always clear. Sometimes people lose their jobs and we can be above or below full employment. We can be above or below trend because markets aren't working properly. The other important part of this is that we don't have perfect information. We don't have perfect information about the world. Money neutrality may not hold. So if you remember, I think on Tuesday, I talked about this example of you take your green dollar bills and you turn them in for red dollar bills. And what should happen to the price level? Well, it should double, right? If you take green dollar bills and turn them in for 2 red dollar bills, the price level should double. Voila. Nothing else should change. That's classical economics. That's money neutrality, right? But the key to money neutrality is that everybody understands what's going on and they're perfectly rational. Maybe that's not such a good description of the world. Oftentimes, people don't know what's going on. They have imperfect information about what's happening, right? If you believe that people have the perfect information about the world, you were asleep during March and April of this year, right? When economists were, completely flummoxed, right? I mean, about what exactly the impact of the pandemic was going to be, right? And there was a lot of risk and a lot of fear, and risk and fear caused people to behave in different ways. And in many ways, that's really at the heart of Keynesian economics, thinking about how risk, fear, and uncertainty can impact macroeconomic outcomes. And so that's going to be the macro model that we develop in this class, right? That's going to be the short run macro model that we develop in this class. So let me give you, I'm going to switch to my iPad here. Before we get into this short run macro model, and as I said, it's really going to take us, 4 days to kind of work through this model, the better part of a week. And so as we kind of develop this model piece by piece, I think it's important before we get in too far into it to begin to think about an overview of the short run macro model so that we know where we're headed. Okay. And this short run macro model is really going to have 3 big pieces, right? It's going to have 3 big pieces. It's going to have multiple small pieces, but it's going to have 3 big things in it that are very clear for us to understand before we get too far into it. The first is The economy is subject to exogenous shocks. These shocks push us away from trend. Okay. We're going to talk about a number of shocks that economies are vulnerable to, such as changes in consumer confidence, or changes in oil prices, or changes in government spending, or changes in taxes, or changes in the money supply, right? Our model is going to incorporate the fact that there are many potential exogenous shocks. And once again, what do we mean by exogenous? That we're not exactly going to explain where these shocks come from. But the economy is subject to these shocks, and these shocks can push us away from trend. And then there's a transition path back to trend. Meaning that short run output can be positive or negative in the short run, right? We can be away from trend in the short run, but in the long run, we're gonna transition back to the trend, right? That's one of the fundamental aspects of this of our short run model. Okay. Second, we are going to incorporate monetary and fiscal policy in our model. Right. Once again, monetary and fiscal policy did not play much of a role in our long run models. I mean, monetary policy impacted inflation, but monetary policy had very little role to play in output or unemployment or any of that stuff. We're going to move off that. We need to understand this because money neutrality may not hold. As a result, unlike what we saw argued by classical economists, a change in the money supply might change short-run output and other real variables. Right? So other real variables might get impacted by a change in the money supply. And so obviously one of the things we want to talk about is stabilization policy. Can we use monetary and fiscal policy to move output towards zero? Right, to move output towards zero. In other words, to minimize business cycles, to stabilize the economy. Can we do that? So monetary policy and fiscal policy are going to be a really important part of this short run model. Sorry, technical problems here. Okay. And then the third important component of this there is a dynamic trade-off between inflation and short-run output. Right? Based on what we talked about on Tuesday, in the long run, inflation has nothing to do with output. But in our short-run macro model, we're going to have to understand that the relationship between inflation and output is much more complicated. And this relationship here is the Phillips curve. So we're going to talk about the Phillips curve here quite a bit, but let me just draw up the Phillips curve for you, and then we will fill in the details later. But the Phillips curve says that there is a relationship between short-run output and inflation. And what is that relationship? It's positive. So in other words, when short-run output is greater than 0, what do we see? Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. This should be the change in inflation. If short-run output is greater than 0, then inflation is going up, right? If short-run output is greater than 0, then the change in inflation is going to be positive. In other words, inflation is going up. Or if we're down here, if short-run output is less than 0, then inflation is falling. So there's this positive relationship between short-run output and changes in inflation. Okay. What's the intuition behind this? Well, what happens during an economic boom when short-run output is above trend? What happens is we begin to have shortages. We begin to have rising input costs. And this begins to push up inflation. And then what happens during a recession? We tend to have a surplus. And we tend to have falling input costs. Right? So think about what's happening right now. We have lots of surpluses, right, during this recession as people have stopped spending money. Falling input costs. If you look at the price of oil, the price of many raw materials, as production has fallen, these input costs have gone down. What does that do to inflation? It puts downward pressure on inflation, which is definitely what we've seen here in the US over the last 9 months. Okay? And so this is the way of the world. And so what policymakers can do, if I can move this back here, is what policymakers can do is they can pick a point on the Phillips curve and try to stimulate output. But what's the cost of stimulating output too high? Inflation. Okay? So there is a trade-off here between inflation and output. And if this sounds very esoteric and you're not sure that you believe that there's a trade-off between inflation and output, just show you this figure where you can see empirically there's not a perfect relationship, and we'll talk about why it's not perfect, but there's a fairly strong relationship between the change in inflation here on the vertical axis and short run output on the horizontal axis. Okay, and so we will spend much more time focusing on this Phillips curve and where it comes from and how do we understand it. Okay? So the fit is not perfect, but notice here the slope of this line is about 1/2. What does that mean? If I want to increase short run output by 2%, I have to change inflation by 1%. Right? Empirically, that's roughly what we observe. To increase output by 2%, I have to accept more inflation of 1%. Okay? All right, so that's kind of a lot to throw at you right at the beginning. And so the purpose of this is not to get you like stressed, like, oh my God, I didn't understand all of that stuff. No, right? We are going to fill in the details as we go along, right? We're going to fill in the details as we go along. The purpose of chapter 9 here is really to kind of do an overview before we begin so that you kind of see where we're going, but also that if at some point in time you get confused about where we are, go back and look at this, right? Go back and look at this, and maybe as we go along, hopefully all that we've kind of talked about will make more sense because we filled in a lot of the details, all right? And so now where we're moving is to begin building this model. And the first step is in chapter 10, short run macro model, right? Short run macro model. And we're going to talk about something called the IS curve, okay? I said chapter 10, I'm sorry, chapter 11. So this is probably a good time to take a break. Let's take a 5-minute break or so. I'll leave this up and running if anybody wants to chit chat, and then we will come back and we will begin talking about chapter 11. Okay. Okay, everyone. Okay. So remember, we will have class, for 45 minutes or so of class this morning, and then we will come back this afternoon. It's a busy day, a lot to get through. So this afternoon, we will finish up chapter 11. Hopefully we'll finish up chapter 11 or come close to it. And then we will talk a little bit about your exam, okay? All right, so let's talk about the IS curve. Okay, so the IS curve is the first part of our short run macro model.
Can you share your screen?
Share the screen? Yes.
Yeah.
All right, I thought I had it up. Sorry about that. All right, first part of our short run macro model. And so the IS curve is the relationship between the real interest rate and short run output. That's what the IS curve is looking at. The relationship between the real interest rate and short run output. How real interest rates impact short run output. Why do we call it the IS curve? Because as we're going to show in a minute, it implies that investment equals savings. It implies that investment equals savings. And so what we're going to show here is that our curve, which is going to have short run output here and the real interest rate here, there's going to be a negative relationship between real interest rates and short run output. The IS curve is going to be downward sloping. Okay? So the IS curve is based on aggregate expenditure. Right? In fact, that's really what the IS curve is capturing, the behavior of aggregate expenditure. So the IS curve is really based on our old friend sorry, I jammed that in here on the right-hand side. Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus EX minus IM. Output is equal to C consumption, I investment, G government purchases, EX meaning exports, and IM meaning imports. Okay, so what we want to do here is we want to model each one of these components. We have to think about how each one of these components behave to create a model. So let's talk about this. How does consumption behave? Well, it behaves according to a consumption function. Whenever I say consumption function, I always think about that old Schoolhouse Rock, right? Conjunction junction, what's your function? Consumption function, what's your function? It tells us what the relationship is or what determines consumption. And so we're going to assume that consumption looks like this. Okay, it looks like this. What is AC? AC is what we call the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, the marginal propensity to consume. It's exogenous. So the marginal propensity to consume here is a number between 0 and 1. It's a number between 0 and 1. So for instance, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.5, what does that mean? $1 worth of income, we consume half of it. Right? We consume half of $1 worth of income. Now, the other important thing here to note, though, is that this is not current output. This is trend output. So in other words, we consume based on trend output, meaning long run output, not short run output. Why is it that we consume based on trend output and not short run output? Or I'm sorry, not current output? Well, that's a great question. And we will talk about this a little bit later this afternoon. But the reason why that we're going to argue this is probably an okay representation of the world is because of consumption smoothing. The argument here is that your consumption is not really based on how much money you make today. It's really based on how much money you think you're going to make over your life. And if you don't believe that's true, then take a good look at your life, right? Right? Because you are all college students. What's your current income? Probably very close to 0. And yet, do you consume 0? No, you consume, right? In part because you say, well, later in life, I'm going to make more money and I can pay for it. And so the argument here is that people really consume based more on long-term trends than they do on short-term trends. That may not always be, though, the most accurate way of thinking about consumption, but we're going to start out with it this way because this is simple. And once again, keeping our model simple, at least to begin with, is a very, very important objective of any model, right? So let's start with the most simple assumption that output is just based on long-run output. It's just based on trend output. And it's a constant fraction of trend output. And that constant fraction, the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, everybody got that down? Okay, here's the second. The second is the investment function. Oops. So just as we had to model consumption, we have to model what investment looks like. Here, things are going to be a little bit more complicated. How are we going to model investment? We're going to model it in this way. This is going to be our investment function. Okay. Once again, we have AI bar here, which is the marginal propensity to invest. So we assume that any long run dollar, right, any change in long run output, a constant fraction of that is going to be invested. So this part of our investment function looks a lot like our consumption function, right? But what's different here is this second part. Big RT is the real interest rate. And little r bar, which we're going to assume is exogenous, is the marginal product of capital. So the marginal product of capital here is exogenous. Likewise, what's exogenous is B. And little b is the elasticity of investment. We all know what elasticity means. How sensitive investment is to a change in the interest rate. How sensitive investment is to a change in the interest rate. So think about what this is saying. This is saying what happens if we go up here in our equation, what happens if the real interest rate goes up? And in fact, the real interest rate goes up above the marginal product of capital, so that RT is greater than R bar. What's going to happen to investment? It's going to go down, right? So we're saying here, an increase in the real interest rate, ceteris paribus, leads to a reduction in investment. And a reduction in the real interest rate leads to an increase in investment. How much? What determines how much? Well, part of it is dependent upon how big our trend output is. That determines how big the change in investment is. But the other important part of this is the elasticity of investment, right? A higher B means, oops, an increase in B bar means that the change in I will be bigger because we're going to be more responsive. The investment will be more responsive to changes in interest rates. However, I want us to be clear here that what's true about this investment function in the long run. In the long run, it has to be the case that the real interest rate has to equal the marginal product of capital. And so in the long run, this is what the investment function is, because that second half of it drops out, right? So in the long run, we have kind of this, think about this as like the steady state level of investment or the long run trend investment. But can we invest more or less than trend? Yes. It depends upon how big the real interest rate is relative to the marginal product of capital. If the real interest rate is above the marginal product of capital, that's going to reduce investment below trend. And if the real interest rate is below the marginal product of capital, that's going to increase investment above trend. Okay, you with me so far? Now, the rest of this, we're just going to assume that the rest of these functions, the rest of the components of expenditure, G and X and IM, are exogenous. In other words, just like we did for consumption, we're going to assume that the government spending looks a lot like consumption. It just has a different marginal propensity to consume. Likewise, exports are exogenous based on the marginal propensity to export. And imports are exogenous based on the marginal propensity to import. So this together is the IS model. This is the IS model. So let's back up here and take a moment. In fact, maybe instead of me writing all this down, I'm just going to refer, let me pull up my, pull up this table 11.1 from your book. So here's table 11.1 from your book, which basically summarizes the IS curve or the IS model that we've just put together here. So what are the endogenous variables? The endogenous variables are Y, C, I, G, EX, and IM, right? The equations of this model are Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus EX minus IM. And then we have the consumption function, the function for government purchases, the function for exports, the function for imports, and then investment. What is exogenous in this model? There's a typo here in this table. Let me write this down. See, I should have just written this down. Right? So what's endogenous? Y, C, I, G, E. Oops. EX, IM. What's exogenous? Trend output. This model assumes trend output is exogenous. Also, all of those marginal propensities are exogenous. And then finally, the marginal propensity to, or the marginal product of capital is exogenous in this model. Now you might say there's one variable missing here. What about RT? Well, tomorrow. Right? This is the next part of the model where we explain where RT comes from. So right now, RT is kind of sitting in that ambiguous way where we haven't really endogenized it yet, but we will tomorrow. We will talk about where RT comes from tomorrow. So I guess right now, for now, treat it as exogenous. Right? For now, treat it as exogenous, and then we're going to change that tomorrow. Okay. Now, we can simplify this down some. Here's our consumption function. I'm sorry, our expenditure function. Let's plug in what we know for each of these. Right. And unfortunately, the equation is too long for me to fit it all in one line. Now, what I want to do is divide each side by trend output. Right? Divide each side by trend output, Y bar. And you'll notice that all of these Y's drop out, right? And so then we're left with this. Okay? Now, okay, let's do a little aside here before we move to the next step. We want to put this in terms of short run output. What is short run output again? It's that. Or another way you could think about it is it's this. In other words, what's YT divided by Y bar? It's equal to short run output minus 1. So we plug this into the expenditure equation above. And now I'm rewriting things a little bit. Okay. I'm getting tired of writing A's. I'm going to put the 1 over on this side. Okay. Now, this is a real problem for us, writing all of these A's, right? So I'm going to define a new variable. Let's just call A bar everything in this parentheses. A bar is all of these little a's minus 1. And we're left with this. This is our IS curve. Right? That is our IS curve. Do you feel a sense of accomplishment? Maybe. So what does this IS curve look like? Well, it looks like what I showed you just a minute ago. What's the relationship between short-run output and the real interest rate here? It's downward sloping. There's a negative relationship between interest rates and short-run output. That's what this curve looks like. However, there's also some other things that we know about this curve, particularly in the long run. What's got to be true on this curve in the long run? Well, as we talked about before, in the long run, it has to be the case that the real interest rate is equal to R bar. So when we're at R bar, well, let me not talk about that here in a minute. Let me get back to that in a second. The other thing that has to be true in the long run is that A bar has to equal 0. A bar has to equal 0. Why? Remember what A bar is. It's this. So what are we saying if we say A bar is equal to 0? In the long run, all of these marginal propensities add up to 1. Because notice here we have a minus 1 in the parentheses. All of these have to add up to 1 in the long run. So in other words, if there's a $1 change in trend output, it has to either be spent on consumption, investment, government spending, expenditure, or imports, right? So in the long run, all of these A's add up to 1. Now, as we're going to talk about, in the short run, that can be different, right? In the short run, countries can borrow and spend more, or they can save. But in the long run, A bar has to be equal to 0. And so if this is true, that R is equal to R bar, the real interest rate equals the marginal product of capital, and if A bar is equal to 0, what also has to be true, according to our equation, is that short run output has to be 0 in the long run. So this is our long run spot. There's a long run spot on this IS curve, and it's right here, where RT is equal to R bar and short run output is equal to 0. Okay? That's our IS curve. I want to do a very brief aside here before we use this and just talk about why do we call this the IS curve? right? Why do we call this the IS curve? Well, remember, for our IS curve, this is true, right? We can rework this around. Oops. Oh, sorry. Let me do it this way. Shoot. Sorry, I was trying to do this the easy way, but now I realize I can't do it the easy way. So I'm going to have to do it the hard way, right? Add and subtract T is equal to taxes. And then just rework things. So I'm going to put this over on this side. Watching this. Put these two over here. And put this over on the left-hand side. And leave I over here on the right-hand side. You're probably saying, what in the hell is Noob doing here? Is he just, does he love algebra? No, but I'm just trying to make a point here. What's that? Income minus taxes minus consumption. This is private savings. It's your total income minus your spending, minus taxes. What's this? Government savings. The difference between government's tax revenue and its spending. And then this over here, the difference between imports and exports is also the amount of foreign savings. In other words, what's true for the IS curve? Total savings equals investment. S equals I, IS curve. Okay. So I was very worried that none of you would be able to sleep tonight if you didn't know why it's called the IS curve. So there you go, right? We could have called it the Y equals C plus I plus G plus EX minus IM curve, but that seemed a little complicated. So I is equal to S, right? It has to be true in an economy that total savings equals total investment, right? Which is another way of saying that aggregate expenditure curve. Okay, so that's where the name IS curve comes from. Before we let you go here for lunch, let's do just a couple of examples of using the IS curve so that we can kind of test how well we understand what's going on here. What happens if we have an increase in RT? What happens along our IS model? So in these kind of questions, always assume that you start in the long run. Right, so let's assume we're starting in the long run where RT is equal to R bar and short run output's equal to 0. Now what happens? Now, if R If R goes up to RT, we simply move along our IS curve and notice that short run output falls. So an increase in the interest rate leads to a reduction in short run output. Let's think about this numerically. If A bar is equal to 0, let's just pick some numbers. If B bar is equal to 2, let's say that the marginal product of capital is 0.05. And then R goes up to 0.6. Right? So the real interest rate goes up from 5% to 6%. What happens to short run output? Well, we just use this equation. A bar is 0. B bar is 2. R is 0.06. R bar is 0.05. Short run output is negative 0.02 or negative 2%.
Where did you get the the R equals 0.06?
So that's just given to you in the problem, okay? So
Oh, okay.
the interest rate was 5% and then it jumps up to 6%.
Okay.
Okay, so in other words, we started here and then R moves up to 6%. What's short run output going to be? Negative 2% if we attach numbers to this graph. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, so I'm just doing numerically here what we just did graphically. What determines how big the fall in short run output is? Well, B, right? B, that elasticity of investment. B tells us how sensitive short run output is to a change in the interest rate. Everyone got that? Let's move on to another example. What we'll call an aggregate demand shock. Let's say that the government decides to do more spending. So AG goes up. And as a result, A bar becomes positive. What happens in our IS model? So here we are at our long run point. Now A bar goes up. Can somebody help me out here? Is this a shift in the curve or a movement along the curve? Well, hint, A bar is exogenous. So if there's a change in an exogenous variable, do you move along the curve or do you shift the curve? I'm going to pretend that I'm hearing, you shift the curve, Todd, right? You shift the curve, right? Because notice RT didn't change here or YT didn't change. It's another variable that changed, A bar. In this case, an increase in A bar shifts our IS curve in this direction. So if the real interest rate doesn't change, what happens to short run output? It becomes positive. Okay. Numerically, you can see from our IS curve that what happens if A bar becomes positive and it goes up to goes up 1%. Then short run output will go up by 1% as well, right? So if A bar goes up from 0 to 0.01, then short run output will go up from 0 to 0.01, assuming there's no change in the interest rate, right? So assuming the interest rate doesn't change, then an aggregate demand shock will lead to an increase in output. So there's many different kinds of aggregate demand shocks here that could fit into this model. I could replace this with a change in AC, or a change in investment, or a change in exports, or a change in imports, right? These are all different forms of the same aggregate demand shock. So our model incorporates many different types of aggregate demand shocks in it. All of them, though, essentially have the same impact on the economy. They increase short-run output, right? They increase short-run output, or a positive demand shock increases short-run output. What happens if A bar fell below 0, right? So for instance, there was a fall in aggregate demand from a fall in consumption or a fall in investment. Well, then that's going to reduce short-run output, right? It's just going to be the mirror image of what we just did here. So our model is incorporating a lot of different types of exogenous shocks in it. A lot of different types. All right, we are running out of time here. So I just want to do one more example. Oops, I think this is example number 3. Okay. What would happen if there was an increase in technology that increased the marginal product of capital? No, this one's a little trickier. I'm going to warn you, this one's a little trickier. So let's think about this. This one is really getting at the heart of whether you understand what this model is talking about. Let's assume that this increase in marginal product of capital also increases trend output, right? Both of these things happen. But what impact does it have on short-run output? That's the key question here. We've had a technology that increases long-run output and increases the marginal product of capital. But what impact does it actually have on short run output? Well, in our graph, if R bar goes up, what happens? R bar moves here, but notice our real interest rate didn't change. We now move to a place where R is less than R bar. So this is somewhat counterintuitive until you think about it a little bit more. But what actually happens to short run output? Short run output goes down. Okay, short run output falls. But notice, it doesn't mean that current output couldn't rise. It could rise, but short run output falls. Okay. If this is all confusing to you, good, right? Because what it means is you haven't thought through what short run output means. In this example, what happens if current output goes up a little bit, but trend output goes up by a lot? Yeah, well, people see their income go up, but notice current or actual output doesn't go up by as much as trend output does. So short run output could actually fall even though current output rises because trend output rose even more. That's what's happening in this example, right? So current output has to rise by as much as trend output. Why isn't it going to rise as much by trend output? Because the interest rate is too high, right? Or, yeah, I don't know if I said that right. All right, does that make any sense? Maybe, maybe not. Yeah. Actually, you know what? I screwed this problem up. As I was talking about it, I just realized that I completely screwed this up. Oh, I hate when I do that. Gosh dang it. All right. You guys got 5 minutes. I hate to do this. Erase this all. Cross it out. I screwed this up. Because what I did not incorporate in here, and I should not have been, I was rushing to kind of get through this and I didn't really think carefully. Okay, let's try this again. All right. So here we are. And then there's an increase in the marginal product of capital. What I did not think about is this increase in R bar should shift the IS curve. Because remember what our IS curve is. It's this. So if R bar goes up, notice that this is subtracted, this actually should increase short run output. That's why I was saying this wrong. So this actually shifts our IS curve in this direction. And so if R bar goes up, we actually move not to a point where short run output is negative, but to a point where short run output is positive. And how did I know I was wrong? Because if interest rates are lower than R, that should stimulate output, right? If you notice what I had a minute ago, I had output going down when interest rates were too low. That didn't make any sense. When I said that in my head, I was like, wait a second, that's not right, right? If interest rates are too low, that shouldn't be reducing short run output. That should be increasing short run output, all right? And so that's what's happened. So if we go back and think about this, short run, the trend output has gone up, but short run output has gone up even more than trend output because interest rates have not risen, right? So while trend output's gone up, short run output's gone up even more because interest rates are lower than R bar. Does that make sense? Hopefully I didn't make too big of a hash of that. If I don't screw up at least one thing in lecture every block, you guys are going to just think that I'm just some sort of perfect robot. And I don't want you to think that anybody's perfect. I mean, I'm very close to perfect, but not quite there. Sorry. So anyway, I apologize for that. I've kept you too long, so I'm going to let you go. If you have some questions and you want to talk about that problem again, I'm happy to pick up with this afternoon. So basically this afternoon, I probably have about half an hour or 40 minutes of new material to cover. I hate to cover that much new material, but really this afternoon, I want to kind of review what we talked about this morning. When I say new material, it's really going to be kind of going back and thinking some more about what we talked about this morning. So we will do that, and then we will do homework, or I'm sorry, we'll cover exam number 1. Okay, we'll go over that very quickly, and then if I should have a little bit of time after class this afternoon, if any of you want to talk to me individually. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Have a good lunch. Back in an hour and a half or so.